I guess there are some questions. I mean, and we would all love to hear some more stories. Any questions, Karen?
It's a question that I think both of you could probably answer. When Alona, you gave us a survey at the beginning of jazz in Israel, but it's still very heavily influenced by the jazz culture in Europe and in the United States. But today, if you turn the radio on and you hear music that you don't even know, you can tell when it's Israeli jazz. Israeli jazz has its own sound often, and I wonder if you can pinpoint when Israeli jazz started sounding Israeli.
I don't totally agree with this distinction. There are many musicians, many good Israeli jazz musicians that differ in their styles of music. Some, as you said, it's really true. You can hear the Israeli trends, the Israeli tradition, like basing their music on Israeli songs from the 1930s or the 1940s, the Hebrew, famous Hebrew songs, like for instance Yuval Cohen, who had a project of David Zehavi's Hebrew songs, and so on. Many Israeli jazz musicians fuse different ethnic music, which I mentioned. Sadnata Jazz was initiator in this respect, and this is true. That's how we can really. That's where we can hear some Israeli trends, but other musicians, other Israeli jazz musicians, don't necessarily base their music on Israeli traditions, Israeli musical traditions. They play what's called straight-ahead jazz, whether it's bebop, which is bebop, hard bop, some very small niche go towards free jazz, like Albert Beger. That is the way I see it. Danny, what do you think?
When you asked when it started with Sadnata Jazz in year 71. I always thought that we have when you try to do something, you think, where do I have my strength? Just playing standards, I guess people in the States, some artists, many of them play better. So we have to use our strengths, and the strengths was what I thought, together with Albert Piamenta, was in ethnic music. So we took ethnic motifs, ethnic songs, Yiddish, Arab, Mid-Eastern, and we transformed them to jazz. And I mean, not using instruments, ethnical instruments, but using jazz instruments. Saxophone, bass, piano, and drums. Nowadays, the ethnical movement, they use all the instruments, and you can hear Indian, Turkish, etc., etc. But this was really a new concept, and it started then. Now, I don't think that there is an Israeli jazz thing. I don't recognize Israeli jazz. I know Israeli players of jazz, and it depends what they play. If they play contemporary music, if they are good, and there are many good ones. But many of them thought later on, had the same thoughts that I had and Albert, that their strengths will be using music from this area. And that's what they do. Avishai Cohen, etc., all the people she mentioned.
I think these trends started more specifically during the 1990s and onwards. And after the jazz festival in Eilat was established in 1987, that year was also a turning point from other respects in Israel. 1987, Jazz's record company by Adam Baruch was established, and that gave a very strong push to Israelis to record their music. And up until that year, very few Israeli jazz records were put out. Another important thing that happened in that year was the beginning of Danny Karpel's program on Galei Tzahal, Kol HaJazz Hazeh, which he was so important for spreading jazz and for helping Israelis to make their music. He often invited them to the studio, interviewed them, played their music. It was a very important respect of his program. So,
Wolfgang? I have so many questions, so I have to limit myself. First of all, I found it completely fascinating, your first example about the cabaret tradition, the German cabaret tradition. So I thought about, did the political undertones of the German cabaret actually survive in those? But that's not my question. Let me actually go to what you just talked about, because one of my questions, and you kind of answered it, so I'm just trying to see whether my own thoughts have any kind of truth. You know, when you talk about jazz reception in Europe, very often people talk about these three stages: imitation, assimilation, emancipation, finding something that you can identify with. And you know, for me, not, you know, only having been to Israel once before and looking at it from afar, I never really thought about it like this. But when you introduced this example of Balkan rhythms, Oriental, Hasidic, I thought, well, you know, in Europe, we basically always limit those emancipation factors that identify, and I'm not talking about German jazz, but that identify a certain approach that might be different from an American approach by one idea, you know, humorous Dutch jazz. The Germans who always try to be a little too perfect. The British who are just a little, you know, the Polish were always a little sad in their music. And then you brought up this example, and I thought, well, is the Israeli side in Israeli jazz, if at all, this multiplicity of ethnic influences? Because that's how this state exists, because you have people who came from Russia, from Germany, from America, from all sides of the world. So that's my first question. And the second question, no, I'll leave it at that. You know. I'm going to ask another question though.
It's a difficult, difficult question. I think it's actually what I said to Karen, more or less. I don't think that you can't generalize about all Israeli jazz musicians as looking for a particular Israeli element to launch their career with in the jazz world. Some do, and some don't. Some just like to play straight ahead jazz and sound as American as possible. And some are looking for the special, different sound that they can bring from their upbringing, from their surroundings.
I must add, you know, that times changed. Nowadays, the whole world is a global village, and information flows. So, again, I'm saying, you know, to my opinion, there is no Israeli jazz. There are Israelis who play jazz, and they know all the dialects, and they know all the styles, contemporary, and they learn, they hear. There is accessibility. But I think the ones who are successful are not just talented musicians, but people who thought, where can I go and be original and do something that is different? And the only different thing they can find here in Israel is the local scene of music, which is Arabic, which is Oriental, etc. And if you look at the successful Israeli musicians, that's what they do. That's the name, Israeli artists in jazz, youngsters.
But there are always exceptions, and I must say, like Avishai Cohen, the trumpeter, I think that he's a contemporary musician, but so successful and has such a high name for him. He made such a high name for himself in the jazz world internationally, without this special niche of local Mediterranean whatever.
Does it too, but
yes, but that's not his main point. And also his sister, Anat Cohen, the amazing clarinetist, she plays shoro, and she's amazing. I mean, she's really amazing.
First met her, you know, she was like 13 or 14 years old. I said, nothing is going to come out of this. Till now, when I meet her, we laugh about this.
Yeah.
One last question before we are going to be thrown out of this hall.
Can I add something? I have the feeling, now when I look at the jazz scene in New York and the Israeli musicians in New York, they are the only group, the absolutely only group of foreigners who are always identified by their nationality. German musicians in New York will not be identified as German musicians, nor will be French or British. That might be in passing, whereas with Israeli musicians, there's always the Israeli clarinetist Anat Cohen, the Israeli trumpeter, and so on and so forth. So might it be that some part of, and I didn't really want to talk about musical identity. Maybe what I was more interested in is this community aspect of what jazz is, where people hang out together, but you know, you come from the same background, so you know what you're talking about, you know what you play, you know all of the influences, you know that this is a multicultural society, whereas the other people that you play with, and that shapes music, so that influences music.
You're right, completely right. You know, they stick together, and they have an identity. So it's easy to identify them.
How do Israeli musicians think about this? Well, we always have the feeling like this exodus of young musicians to New York, stronger than in any other country.
It's not an exodus. They come back, they move. Here, as I said before, it's a village now, all the world. They go to New York, they play, stay 3-4 months, they come to Israel, stay 3-4 months, they go back, etc., etc. Most of them have their base here, the famous ones. Yeah, they are here. But of course, they are in New York too, and they are all around the world in the festivals and wherever. But you are right. It's also, I think, maybe not nice to say, but it's a political thing too. The Israelis. We are notorious. Yeah.
My question has to do with this whole group of Israeli, very successful jazz musicians are cutting edge, and there's also an amazing cutting edge modern and avant-garde dance scene in Israel, which is, again, fusion of so many things. It's straight dance, straight modern dance, but some of it is uniquely Israeli in feel. Is there a connection between the jazz, the explosion of jazz among young people and the explosion of Israeli dance companies, and do they work with each other artistically?
I'll tell you, for myself, I don't really know. I mean, I'm not an expert in dance. I know what you say is true because I know what's going on, and I go to concerts and to ballet and to dance. But I think the creativity spirit is there. And, well, you know, maybe there is something in the genes of Jewish people in Israel that drives them into artistic activity more than in other places. I don't know, but the fact is that you're right.
Good. Tell my husband that.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Alona. Thank you all. See you at the concert.